When you first walk onto our land, the first space you'll meet is our main forest garden, our Zone 1. This is a wonderfully biodiverse space where we've planted veggies, medicinals, trees, and bushes. Hundreds of different species all grow together in this really wild configuration, and that's including both the productive species we've planted along with plenty of native species that have spontaneously sprung up. And something that makes managing this space a bit difficult is how powerfully some of these species can grow. They're incredibly well adapted to this region, and within a month they can go from winter calm to spring frenzy, and their growth can suffocate some other species that are still establishing themselves, like this honeyberry, for example, or other species that would get completely shaded out if you let them be overgrown, like this bugleweed. What's happening is that there's so many little relationships establishing themselves in this part of the forest that, to help them all out, I have to step in and clean out our forest garden. And I'm calling it cleaning, even though in reality it's more of a purposeful disturbance. Hopefully in the same way that an elephant knocking down a tree in a savanna is engineering an ecosystem. So today let's take a look at my yearly routine of spring cleaning in the forest garden. Why I disturb the ecosystem like this, how I'm hopefully shaping a beautifully diverse and healthy ecosystem, and a bit of the history of the space since it kind of informs how I arrived at this sort of arrangement. Everyone who gardens will eventually arrive at a completely unique style that results from their own personality, and hopefully also from the personality of the land that they're on. The way I garden here is just that. It's a learned symbiosis unique to this space. It's not a style I'd recommend everywhere, and not a system I would design here again if I were to start from zero. It's this sort of learned collaboration in which we do our best to care for everyone who's found their way here, and every year as I learn a bit more, see how the plants react, and continue to respect some of the mistakes I've made in previous years, the style and the land, they continue to transform. If you've seen our tour of the forest video, you'll know our design is a moving target. One that started for us in 2013 when my brother started planting out his first veggie gardens in this very space. And for our first few years caretaking the land while the hazelnuts and a few other fruit trees were growing in, it remained our main vegetable garden. But over the years, as my lifestyle changed, so did my needs. I started leaving the forest for weeks and sometimes months at a time, and that was happening pretty often, so I couldn't care for the garden with the same continuous attention that I used to. And I had to start changing the composition of the space to match my needs. I couldn't continue to plant veggies which would dry out or get completely overgrown by the time I returned, so my focus shifted from annuals to species that were okay spending weeks without being watered or wouldn't be bothered by getting shaded out for a few weeks at a time. So basically I started a slow accumulation of perennials, plants that live more than 1 year. I started sticking loads of cuttings straight in the ground in autumn and letting them root directly in the soil, planting in new bushes like myrtle and uni, new perennials like cardoon and wormwood, and plenty of others. All of which is to say that what I'm left with here is this hybrid space where I'm left navigating somewhere where I'm still planting veggies in certain spaces left between the perennials and the trees, while I'm waiting at the same time for some of those species to fully establish. And in practice, where that leaves me is reacting to this tremendous burst of growth that spring brings, which, exactly as you'd expect, means there's plenty of waiting to do. Pulling out different types of grasses along with a few native species. But where I differ from the style of weeding you're probably used to seeing is how I don't just go in and remove everybody I didn't plant myself without a second thought. My main goal is the management of the relationships between species in a way that hopefully respects native wildness along with the species that I did plant in this ecosystem, which means that I'm pulling out a lot of roots, but I'm also leaving plenty in. I love seeing little patches of dead nettle intermixed with chives, for example, or this medicinal ground ivy growing beneath this apple and currant. But on the other side of that, there are certain species that I will try to knock back to zero, like switchgrass and nettle. Luckily, when it comes to grasses, there's less and less every year, which is pretty interesting for a space that used to be basically 100% grass. This single intervention of pulling out the last few grasses and the increased shadiness of the landscape make it so that they diminish year after year. Then, as for the nettle, it's not that I don't want nettle around. I actually really like nettle. It's just that you can find nettle so many places in the forest that I don't necessarily need it here, where I spend the majority of my time and it will gladly sting me at every opportunity. This is also the time of year that I finally break down all of the skeletons of those plants that made woody stalks last year, like pokeweed or Jerusalem artichoke or sunflowers. I like to leave most of them standing through winter because I don't know enough about insects to say which particular type of insect will take residence in them, but what little I know tells me that there is a type of bug specialized in every possible type of niche and ecosystem, so cutting those woody skeletons would probably deprive those bugs of their winter residence. So this is a job I try to wait for as long as possible to do, pushing it into spring before I start breaking them down to mulch the soil, because I'm hoping I've left them long enough for their eggs to hatch or for these bugs to complete whatever cycles of growth they need. And if anyone has a better guess when it comes to how I'm affecting these bugs, I would love to hear it down in the comments, so please let me know. The other major part of the season's work would be a deepening of the design, a checkup and reorganization of the species that are here to see how they've reacted to the past year. So this weeding gives me an opportunity to get up close and personal with the minor details of what's happening in the land. It lets me look out for niches that might benefit from a new species, like this old raised bed that I'm letting melt back into the earth. And as it goes, I think it could benefit from a few new species to hold the earth. So I'm breaking off chunks of some chocolate mint from some other established plants I have elsewhere, and I'm bringing them in here. It also lets me take some space for spring flowers and ephemerals, as they can get shaded out pretty quickly. And since their presence has the potential to replace a lot of the micronutrients in the soil that have been lost to erosion over winter, it's really nice to give them the little bit of space that they need. Weeding also gives me an opportunity to identify species that I like having around, but maybe not in this exact spot where they were born. So sometimes what I'll do is dig up species like angelica or primrose or wild fennel and transplant them into a bed I have dedicated to just natives. This whole process lets me check in on how some of the guilds are developing, like these lemon balm growing just tall enough to shade out the majority of their competitors, while keeping themselves short enough that bushes like red currant, goji, and chokeberry can easily pop up over them. It also lets me see how some of last year's plantings are reacting to their new niche, like this rhubarb, that got a bit shaded out by some Jerusalem artichoke and is coming back a bit weaker than maybe they could. This weeding process really lets me do so much. I'm also able to identify some niches, not just in the garden, but in time. I could go through the effort of pulling out this stand of native chickweed, for example. Chickweed is an incredibly mineralized and tremendously tasty green, which grows mostly throughout winter. But within a few weeks of spring starting, the chickweed will all start to die back, and when they do, I'll be left with a nice open spot to plant some corn. Or this borage, which, even though I forget to harvest most of the time, is really wonderful for soups. The borage grows mainly in spring, and though it takes up a lot of space, will complete their cycle of growth, flowering, and seeding probably by mid-May, which means that they're currently making the bees very happy with all their flowers, and will eventually make me very happy when I can cut them back to feed the soil, and then have that space to plant out some veggies perhaps in late spring. Basically what I'm doing is keeping on the lookout for ways to balance the needs of the space with my own needs, as this is the most pivotal moment of the year for reflection and disturbance. Another interesting thing that's happening in these parts is my experimentation with becoming a lazy gardener. I like to prioritize low-effort species like perennials, like I've mentioned, but I'm also pretty fond of self-seeding annuals, something that will be different in every forest for every person, but a few that I've found that are really working well here are this perennial buckwheat, which sprouts out from the roots every year, but is also starting to self-seed in a really satisfying way. Then there's some species that self-seed in a very limited way, and this disturbance allows them to be opened up to light so that they can establish themselves before the summer. And here I'd place species like miner's lettuce and edible leaved chrysanthemum, two greens that are really tasty and whose seeds I always kind of forget to harvest, so I'm pretty lucky that they end up coming out during this process. But for me, the crown jewel of these self-seeding annuals is the walking leek, which we haven't planted in the past 4 years, but we've eaten continually and is even in the first stages of nativizing into other parts of the forest. Now, before we wrap up, I have to admit that I'm not fully happy with this way of doing things. Waiting like this leaves a lot of bare soil, which means that the sun's radiation can kill off the top layer of microorganisms and weaken the soil. What plays in my favor here is how fast some species grow during this part of the year. Like these hops, for example, who've been growing for less than a month and have already grown almost 2 meters. That's like 5 or 6 centimeters a day, which is crazy. So I'm hoping that this burst of spring growth will cover the soil and I can keep that damage to the microorganisms at a minimum. And of course this is solvable. I could easily bring in plenty of organic matter or compost to feed and protect the soil, and that would even suffocate a lot of those native plants that I am weeding out, but that would at this point take resources and time that I don't really want to expend in this way. So even though I would love to see it all mulched, my goal isn't to make the perfect system, but to build more fertility every year than I destroy. So at a certain point, I just have to say, good enough. The ideal for me is a garden that, at some point in the future, needs me just enough. Just enough to keep me happy, and just enough that I'm not really interfering too much with the natural processes of the forest. And in a relationship this complex with so many different species, what this means is that eventually I'd like for the forest to be a kind of moving palette that maintains itself. And I would be able to keep my interventions limited to just the fun stuff. But until that day comes, pulling out the weeds is just the way I'll be doing things here. It requires a bit more attention, but it's actually a really pleasant job, especially as the soil gets looser year after year and plants just start to pull loose pretty easily. And if you keep in mind that this isn't a style I'd spread throughout the whole forest, as it would quickly become kind of tedious, in these few 100 square meters, it's a lovely experience in which, strangely enough, disrupting the ecosystem allows me to strengthen some of the connections I'm trying to build. And by this point in the life cycle of the forest, that disruption is the main tool I can use to co-create this completely unique and beautiful ecosystem.